Good afternoon and welcome back to the Eudora Welty Writers Symposium here at Mississippi University for Women, sponsored by the Department of Languages, Literature, and Philosophy and our low residency MFA program in creative writing. This afternoon's session will start with our Ephemera Prize for high school writers. We had a number of schools and I think a little over 60 students from around the state of Mississippi submit their work to be judged by our two judges for this year, Sandra Meek and Juyanne James. And out of those, they made the difficult decisions to choose 5 winners and 5 honorable mentions. And as I understand it, the conversation and the competition was highly intense. We're glad to be able to honor all of you all today. And I'll be handling that part of it since I was kind of organizing the contest, and then we'll turn it over to our moderator for this afternoon after the Ephemera Prize winners have read their works. And our moderator is Dr. Alan Nichols, who is new to our department and teaching in English education. So Alan, thank you again for agreeing to moderate. The Ephemera Prize, as I said, is open to all high school students, grades 10 to 12 in Mississippi and nearby Alabama. Your estimation of what's nearby is as good as ours. And we also open it to students from other states if they're sponsored by an MEW alumnus or alumni. Again, really wonderful writing from all around the state. I wanted to keep us on gallery view so that we can see our honorable mentions, and then I'll switch our view in Facebook and focus in on our readers. So the honorable mentions in alphabetical order are Luke Bowles of Buckatana for So This Is Wayne County, Jalen Jones of Clarksdale for Submerged in the South and Open Casket, Raid Kabir of Biloxi for Individualism of Culture, Amelia Pope of Aberdeen for Can't I Live and Be, and Stephanie Russell of Van Cleve for Lock and Key. So if we had unlimited time, we might ask everyone to read, but if you're curious about these honorable mentions, their work will be published in our Ephemera Prize anthology, which we will hope to have on our website fairly soon. But each year we also choose 5 prize winners, and in those prizes, we do not rank 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, or anything like that. We also do not have categories, fiction, poetry, or essay, or story poetry, or essay. We allow submissions from high school students in any of those kinds of writing, but we look at them all together and try to pick. It's a difficult task every year to pick 5 to receive a $200 award. And again, everyone receives the same award. That check should be in the mail, if not already, very, very soon. So again, because there's not 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, I'll announce them in order, and I'll ask you to read your work after I've announced your prize. The first is to Joshua Bates of Forest for I Apologize If You Feel Something. Joshua.
Hello. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Good? Okay. I looked at her holding that aluminum walking stick, waiting on her to say something. But as her short feet began to carry her forward, and her lips remained sealed, I knew it was time to begin. I dropped the headphones over my ears, and the eerily soothing sounds ensued. The world between my ears and the speakers was a tight and small one, filled with nothing more than air. But this limited existence was a conspiracy I would never subscribe to. The sound echoed out, lifting into a great and empty theater with the strings of faceless and passionate players. It was an orchestra, its veins sparking with energy. It begged for a new world, a larger one less tamed in uniform. No matter what perception of the surrounded world would urge me to believe, it was not confined to these usual rules of existence. And it begged of me to do the same, dragging me from the monotony of my life and placing upon my tongue that slightest taste of greatness that I knew there could be. Only speaking, I apologize if you feel something. I followed behind her as she quickly crossed the highway and into the cemetery behind our house. I was exempt from this world, peering at it through a window, feeling it but not experiencing. The chilled January air brushed across my arms and hundreds of stones passed me by, bearing names I didn't recognize, and a few I did, making me ponder my ultimate end. Crows flew overhead. The dark oak tree shook in the wind, and a rotting corpse lay just 6 feet below me. I felt it all, but somewhere deep in my core, if you tore away all the fake smiles and forced tears, I was nothing. I was numb. But I was exempt from that world, instead residing comfortably in the haven crafted by the gracious sounds floating their way up to my ears. In that place of peace, I could look out and understand the world around me. I understood death. I understood the way it made me feel and when it meant to be nothing. I understood why the birds above called out to the sky as they stood on the branches of the oak, watching over their kingdom of stone. I looked back over at my home, at the bottom of the hill, understanding why it stood forever alone in value. And as I slowly caught up to my mother on the road, I understood her love and why it continuously carried her out into the cold for me. I was fascinated by existing, determined to figure out what it meant and how it worked. I was alive, but only for 51 minutes and 54 seconds. In that time, I would leave the cemetery and walk along one of the endless, interchangeable back roads of Mississippi. As a child, it was simply a smooth place to ride bikes with my sister, treading our way up the towering hills, just for 30 seconds of exhilarating speed down the other end. Upon that compact gravel, there were conversations with a father I was still too young to understand why I hated. There was the fear of watching my sister dive into the ditch and cutting open her toe just to dodge a car. And some part of my overall growth seemed to be harbored by the trips that I made down that road. But eventually, all of that was lost. For years following, it meant nothing at all. The road was abandoned, and my brain lost the memory somewhere deep within. Life changed in that time. Bikes sat unused, leaned up against the dying pear tree in the center of my backyard, for my sister and I had both traded them for vehicles. She then used that vehicle to drive 2 hours south every week to a place that existed outside what I knew, leaving me alone and making even the places I did know become unfamiliar. Childhood ended at the same time I finally understood why I hated my father, a striking revelation I had as I searched for that stub-nosed .38 special to defend my mother with. Later, that gun would become my friend once more, but this time I was the target. Thankfully, I didn't find it either time. Even the reason I eventually returned to the road years later was tainted with pain. A deep hatred for myself manifested into insecurity. I would step off the scale in the bathroom and turn to the mirror, watching a stretch mark slowly crawl all over my body, engulfing me like a flame of shame, a mere preview into the evilness that had corrupted my soul. So I headed back down that road in late December, determined to morph myself into someone else. I would rid myself of myself, grinding my body and mind against the road like sandpaper if I had to. Day after day, I walked along the road, leaving my mother far out of sight. I was alone in the rubble of my childhood, memories I had convinced myself didn't exist and meant nothing. But with my headphones laying that soft blanket of music over my ears, I was exempt from that world. I no longer had to deny it, and shove it away, for it didn't exist anymore. I felt it, but I didn't experience it. For weeks I stayed numb to it, using my musical haven as an excuse to ignore my past. Shed a few calories and walk back home. But eventually, my temporary exemption from existing became not a curse, but a gift. Just as the crows in the trees and the bodies in the ground, I began to understand. The walls inside me came tumbling down, and the numbness of my core was overthrown for the first time in years. I was filled with real pain and joy as tears carried out of my eyes long tucked away sorrows, and the laughs that sprang into the air were justified. I was something again. I could feel. I didn't know it at the time, but that road had failed to become the tool of destruction like that 38 special. Instead, it was a vessel to a brighter world I had forgotten existed. On that road, a man that would later become my first boss occasionally passed me on a tractor, and I walked by houses I would do work at to earn my first paycheck. On that road, I contemplated leaving my home and moving 2 hours away, much like my sister. Despite my worst intentions, the road would become where I changed. Not into a slim and happy human being, but into someone who could face their own existence and accept who they were. One day, unmarked to any calendar, I returned to that road for the last time, for I didn't need it anymore. I didn't just feel alive for 51 minutes and 54 seconds of the album's length. I felt alive with every waking breath. I would later carry out that decision to move away, igniting the best year my life has ever seen, but not because I was constantly happy. The year following my final trip to the road was filled with more tears than ever before, but it was the genuine pain behind those tears that made it all worth it. Sometimes I let myself return to the calming and rhythmically luminescent world of that music, and I still find it whispering to me, "I apologize if you feel something." And only now do I see how right it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Our second winner in alphabetical order is Callie Matthews of Meridian for Reclaiming the Soil You Sprouted From.
As a child, living in Mississippi meant trips to your Nana's house, meals abundant in cornbread, homegrown lima beans, and ice-cold sweet tea. You once watched the pristine, sparkling dunes of white dissolve into an amber ocean, swirled by a wooden spoon in conversation. You once swept after dinner. As a child, living in Mississippi meant summers spent swimming in above-ground pools and watching neighborhood kids pop wee leaves in your driveway. Living in Mississippi once meant listening to the endless orchestral concert of crickets within the fading humid day. Living in Mississippi meant marveling at magnolias. However, as a young teenager, living in Mississippi meant an overbearing sun breathing down your neck, a developed distaste for biscuits and leftovers packed in yogurt containers, and an annoyance towards endless glasses of sweet tea. Living in Mississippi then meant an aversion to Southern vernacular, as the words you once spoke so freely began to encapsulate a rather unpleasant stereotype. As a young teenager, living in Mississippi meant a vow to escape the Magnolia State, a vow not alone in its creation nor its reason to find acceptance, to find a more pleasant summer, to find yourself treated with the respect of a proper-speaking Northerner. But living in Mississippi in this day and age means so much more than iced tea and irritability. Living in Mississippi means home. It means a familiar shape on a map. It means youth and so many splendid summers. It means peaceful, curvy roads and family. Living in Mississippi means the pride you feel when you stand as a representative of your state. It means the loyalty that burns in your heart every time others characterize your lush, hospitable home as merely a blemish of a statistic. It means sweltering summers spent melting on porches and living in the moment, it means elation stemming from the rarity of an inch of snow in the winter. Living in Mississippi means more than any survey, any foreign perspective, any caricature. Therefore, you no longer vow to abandon the soil you sprouted from. You seek to tend to it and give it the care it deserves.
Thank you, Kylie. That's beautiful. Next is Skylar Nichols of Laurel for her poems Stitches, Scissors, Seams, Early Sunday Mornings, and Homebodies.
Hello, I'm just making sure y'all can hear me before I start.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Good judgment.
Stitches, scissors, and seams. Grandma's eyes have aged so that she sometimes misses a stitch, and the seam goes jagged. She's become like a vocalist whose throat fights against the melody. With a curse under her breath, she'd yank the polyester from the machine and get into good lighting. Hands shaking and gentle, she pulled out thin threads with a seam ripper and tweezers. After she started again, she'd put everything into those knives. Back, bent, and foot pressed on the pedal, a needle dancing lightning quick, almost sewing her fingers into the fabric. My grandma sewed to make ends meet. Late nights filling order after order, hands cramping from stitching every stone to glittering dresses, her scissors cutting sharp lines for tucks and suits, laboring over clothes she'd never wear. And this one is early Sunday morning. Before my dad left, we drove to church 3 times a week. Twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. I would comb and pin my hair, black shoes would pinch our feet. My mother would dab on her only perfume. They still sell that perfume, memories stored in a golden tester bottle. I walk by a kiosk in the mall, and for an instant, I feel I'm in the car on Sunday morning. I am a small girl on a pew who does not know the hymns and believes all kindness, struggles at praying and sleeps like an angel, her cheek red from the fabric. The pins are lost between the seat cushions. While I learned about God, I also learned a Southern Pentecostal church is a place full of contradictories. How is a malicious man a good one if he goes to church? People are people and will ignore scripture like they ignore problems, pick and choose sins like they are a bag of candy. I love to watch early morning dew race down the car window. Watch the same houses until we got to the edge of town. My mom would scold me for not sitting up straight. I never imagined that I would do something else on Sunday. And this one's Homebody. Home for me feels like an exit on the interstate. It has what you need, and you're often welcome. Some have kinder people, and some are more crowded. Difference is, everyone knows who I am at this short stop. This is not only my first, and by now I'm familiar with this one. I might try and find a new one out in Texas, maybe even farther west. A small boy with his hand clutching a bag of candy and the other in his mom's hand. He's about the age we begin to lose teeth. So he probably understands me the most. He knows, like I do, when you are missing something. It is extremely hard not to notice. You cannot stop checking to see for the taste of pennies. That is why I search every exit and count my breath. This interstate does not have maps, though, and I do not have my mom's hand to hold on to. It has the occasional sign, but even those are painted with rust and used for target practice by the locals. Like a little kid, I often find myself worrying about being there already. I never know where the next exit is until I reach it. All I can do is hope and pray for serendipity. Hope it is a good one and that I can stay for long. One that is warm and has kind people. Because that is what everybody does.
Thank you, Skylar. So our next prize winner is Lauren Stamps of Mount Olive for Midnight by the Pearl.
There was something special about living so close to the Pearl River, something that I couldn't quite describe to someone without sounding like I had lost every last piece of glass from the broken marbles in my head. The moss hanging from the oak trees dangled over the running water like God's hands resting their fingertips in the stream of their own creation, and the spider lilies sprung up every autumn without fail, sucking the water from the river like a youngin' guzzling down a soda pop. Chirping frogs, crickets playing their bodies like violins, and the soothing sounds of the rushing water pulling itself over the jagged, red rocks could coax anyone into a beautiful slumber. And that's how it was most nights, being welcomed by the branches waving shadows from my window and to bed with my husband, who usually arrived drunk as a skunk before the nighttime Mississippi ambience pulled him into a deep sleep, much like a pine tree needle being carried gently by the river that he oh so adored. We would wake up in the early mornings to the sound of bluebirds and chickadees tweeting happily as they flew in and out of their nests, twirling around in the humid air. I was always told I was like a child who never grew old, and now I had a child of my own growing inside me, waiting to hear the same chirps and see the same glistening river I did every morning. I like to view myself as one of those birds, gliding every which way, living each hour like it was my last, and feeling every emotion that came to my mind as strongly as I could. So when the other side of my bed grew cold and empty for longer every night, my heart grew hot and beat faster than the second hand on the birch clock hanging from the peeling cabin walls. It wasn't until I'd hear the creak of the front door my heart would simmer down. The missing warmth and weight of the bed reappeared, along with a deep sigh from the man I loved. "You're home late again, William Wallace," I muttered, my face still buried in the feather pillow. "I know, Hazel," William Wallace groaned as he buried himself in the blankets. "Won't happen again." "That's what you said last time." "I know, Hazel." My fingers fiddled under the covers until I found his, and after wrapping them around one another, I moved a caring thumb up and down the base of his palm. Sighing with contentment, he pulled me closer and brought his forehead to my collarbone, and while the mattress springs croaked like the frogs outside, I closed my eyes. "This isn't going to make up for it, mister," I said, giving a smile he couldn't see. "How about you and I head down to the ice cream parlor tomorrow evening?" he responded with a chuckle. We have a few spare nickels around this place somewhere, right?" "Probably so," I sighed. "That's my girl," he whispered, giving me a quick peck on the cheek as I drifted to sleep, the anxiety seeping away slowly along with the sounds of the rushing water. "That's my Hazel."
Thank you, Lauren. Our last Ephemera Prize winner for this afternoon and for 2020 is, alphabetically, Avalyn Strain of Columbus for I Call That Beautiful.
Hello, everyone. I am Abby. This is I Call That Beautiful. First, can everyone hear me? Yes, I see now. Okay. I call that beautiful. I can't help but see poetry in everything. When it is 3:24 a.m. and my best friend calls to tell me that he is sitting in a motel room alone, reading my favorite book for the fourth time, I call that loneliness. I would kiss his forehead if he were next to me, tell him, "You are the starry night," and wipe the tears off of his cheeks. But instead I say, 191 days, and he replies with 658 miles, and the call ends. When I sleep in my sister's bed, she wakes me up with a video, a voice I now only hear in my dreams. "Abby, I love you." And my voice responds, "I love you too," thick with laughter. I call that long dead. My tears scream for Exodus, and I tell them they have only been in Egypt for 8 months. They have 499 years and 4 months left before Moses comes. 499 years and 4 months left before fresh plagues can set them free. When it is 4:32 a.m. and my head swims with things I shouldn't be drinking, I tell a boy that he is beautiful. By the way his heart beats in response, I don't think anyone has ever told him he is the ocean before. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And I call that injustice. I hear myself tell him that I am not a foundation, that he cannot build something here. But when he kisses my forehead and tells me, "You are the starry night," I don't think he remembers the traffic signals, red and yellow and green, synchronized flashing, beautiful harmony. When my mother tells me she bought a wedding dress, we are riding on the bypass. She does not mention that there are no plans for a wedding. She does not take her eyes off the road. I call that discretion. She plants daisies in her chicken coop and cries over missed grad school assignments. She is as vast and as beautiful as the night sky, and I wonder if anyone has ever told her she is the starry night. I love her enough to water her daisies, but even I forget that she is beautiful. When the car is going 7 miles per hour, I slip out of the door anyways, feet bouncing off asphalt trampoline, legs swinging over the side of my friend's boyfriend's convertible. I am chasing the feeling of wind in my hair, and I call that freedom. We look up at the starry night, and someone tells me they love how quickly Columbus, Mississippi fades to the middle of nowhere. And I tell them that I have been raised to fade to nothing, just like my town. In this moment, everything is forever, and I count the seconds and the stars in between until it is all nothing again. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you all, all meaning all 5 of you and all 10 of you and all 60 plus of you who submitted to the Ephemera Prize. I can't help but think that Southern writing is in awfully good hands with this young generation. So now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for this afternoon, Ellen Nichols.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to be listening to 2 readers today, Juyanne James and Sandra Meeks. I'm going to introduce them, then after they read, you'll have a chance to ask questions or make comments. If you're on Facebook, we have several people who are keeping an eye on Facebook and can ask your questions for you. So let me start by introducing Juyanne James. She has an MA in literature from the University of New Orleans and an MFA in writing from Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky. She's associate professor of English at the University of Holy Cross in New Orleans. Her short fiction has appeared in various journals, including the Louisville Review, Mythium, the Journal of Contemporary Literature and Cultural Voices, and 1111, as well as the anthology Something in the Water, 20 Louisiana Stories. She has written for Symphony Space's Selected Shorts Commissioning Project and has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize on 3 occasions. Her story, The Elderberries, appeared in the News Stories from the South Best of 2009. She has also published the personal essay Table Scraps in Bayou Magazine, which was a notable in Best American Essays 2014. Her books include The Persimmon Trail and Other Stories and Table Scraps and Other Essays. Table Scraps, the book from which she will be reading today, is a series of autobiographical essays about her life and family as she was growing up in rural Louisiana and her later visits back home. In Table Scraps, she explores the joys and tragedies of her life and coming to terms with a father who was far from perfect. David Rutledge, editor of Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans, writes of Table Scraps that on her grace path to truth, Juyanne James travels through a vivid landscape of humor, blues, and a vivid kind of personal revelation, available only in a rare writer. James brings the reader not only into her upbringing in rural Louisiana, but into the heart of a family with all its challenges, complexities, and above all, love. Juyanne?
Unmute. Thank you, Alan, for an incredible introduction. First, let me say thank you so much to everyone at MUW, Kendall, president, students in the MFA program. Like the other writers that have come before me, I really love coming here, even though this year is figuratively. It's just great, wonderful to be in your presence once again. If I could just speak for a moment about those wonderful, I mean, absolutely exceptional writers that Sandy and I had to choose from, it was really difficult. And I'm sure she'll speak to that as well. We took some time and we went back and forth, but I mean, there were so many great writers. All the ones that were in the honorable mentions could have been in the top 5. Some of the things that I looked at, maybe just as some feedback to some of the writers, young writers, if there was, maybe a poet who gave us 3 beautiful poems and up against maybe a poet who only gave us 1, you typically might lead towards the one who gave us more. Things like that. Presentation, something you should think about when you're presenting your work. Make sure you've taken care of all the errors and your work is presented as best as it possibly can. And then for me, it was all about the assignment. We're looking for something very Southern. And I thought about Eudora Welty, and I wanted to put myself, Natasha said last night that, she began to write her memoir. She thought about Eudora Welty and how she might have done that. Well, I sort of tried to put myself in her place and wondered who would she choose of these writers as well? How many of them or who specifically spoke to the assignment and did it best? So that's just some feedback for you young writers if you continue to support, present your work, which I hope that you will. Okay, so today I'll be reading 2 of my essays from my memoir. The first one is called Table Scraps. I want to read that because people typically love hearing me read it and I enjoy reading it. But also because it speaks of a time that is sort of long past, it's gone. You don't really see it too much. So I really enjoy reading that, going back to my past. And I also want to read my final essay. It's really brief, but it sort of closes out the memoir and it shows you the progression of the memoir itself. And I also like to think that, a lot of times people, like when I had my stories, said, well, which of those stories should I read first? And I always say, well, read the first one and then read the last one and then kind of find your way in the middle. I feel the same way about these essays. Read that first one and then the last one, and the others, I think, will make more sense. Okay. So I hope you enjoy it. Table Scraps. In those early days, we never thought about our innocence. We just lived it. My mother was a big part of everything. Actually, she was the most important part. She led us and taught each of us equally. She always had some saying or another, some tidbit of information that we could wrap ourselves in to use as protection against whatever might come. She used to say, for example, keep living. And we understood that she knew what she was talking about. She used those words as though she had personally seen retribution turn around and head straight for anyone who might have harmed her. When she said this, her eyes were their most honest, and yet a wry smile would turn up on the left side of her mouth. My mother surely knew that people who willingly harmed others would never manage to escape this life without inviting harm to themselves, even if one of the people she was talking about sat in the very room with us. Sometimes I think that when my mother said, keep living, what she really meant was to always be in awe of this great world that we live in. And that if we allow ourselves, there would always be wonder and amazement, even through the trials of life. Just keep living, she would say, and things will always balance out in the end. Big Black women, they scare people sometimes. My mother scared her share. She got into the habit of running certain unwelcome people from our house, our first house in Sunny Hill. One day, a police officer came by claiming that our neighbor's cow had gotten into our field and that my parents had better return it. My mother stood in the doorway of this first house where most of us children spent our formative years, where we worked a dairy business that was not our own, and where we children were sent out on early mornings during the summers to work picking one of the white farmer's crops. She stood holding the screen door wide open, her eyes never leaving the peace officer. He was young and thin, his uniform still searching for his frame. He is the law, we children thought to ourselves. And yet he stands near the gate, not even attempting to come up the steps and onto the porch. He almost had to yell to my mother. The cow ain't here, my mother told him this several times before she sent my brother for my father's rifle. The officer then rushed to his car and drove off, leaving dust to settle on the situation. But we knew this kind of thing didn't happen everywhere or all the time. This was a small town, back in the boonies kind of police officer who knew my mother as an honorable person. And in knowing my mother, he knew that whatever she said, she meant. No questions were to be asked, and certainly not the same question over and over. And it always seemed to me that in those days, people understood how to respect each other and the true concept of right and wrong. I can still feel my mother's thick, generous hands push me out of the front door on those summer mornings when we would be sent out to work. My mother always awakened me with the others, Lionel, Willie, and Vanessa, all of whom were older than I was, though we were never certain. The workman would allow me to go. I'm sure I was 6 or 7 at the time, but I didn't truly start growing until much later when I turned 13. My mother always said it was because I had pneumonia and measles when I was a baby. You barely survived, she'd say. But on those summer mornings when we were hired out to work, my tiny frame must have appeared strange to the white farmers who, although generally interested in hiring as many people as possible to pick their crops, even they had limits. Apparently, I was that limit. I see the 4 of us standing outside the house, just beyond the gate, waiting for the man to get out of his truck sometimes, and the culling process to begin. There was no looking at teeth or squeezing of arms and legs to find the proper muscles, but he did inspect us with his eyes, staring us up and down and back again. Get on the truck, he'd say to my brother. Immediately afterwards, my sister Vanessa, tall and lanky, yet only a year older than me, would be told to climb on the truck. You too, the man would say, and I knew he was talking about my older sister, Willie. They never lingered when they saw Willie. Everyone knew she worked as though she'd taken work-inducing drugs. She moved up and down those rows of cucumbers, beans, peas, turnips, and whatever else we were picking at almost twice the speed of everyone else. Sometimes Willie would bargain with the farmers and convince them to take me along, saying, "She won't be no bother. I'll make up her row." Sometimes they just didn't want to be trouble, and I would be sent back into the house, tears not quite falling until I reached my mother. Although she would pull my head to her thigh and tell me to stop crying, she could never soothe the hopeless regret that I felt, all because I felt like I somehow let my family down. I would then spend the day helping my mother cook or clean, and if we had no other work to do, we would help my father with the farm labor. My mother used to say, "If you sing before breakfast, you'll cry before dinner." That early morning hour was reverenced, a time to recognize the Lord's business, to commune with your loved ones, or do whatever, but it was never a time to sing. Apparently, singing that early in the day could be considered a slap in the Lord's face, for he hadn't the time to reveal to us just what kind of day he wanted us to have. For similar reasons, we couldn't sing at the dinner table, girls couldn't whistle, and particularly, no one could iron on Sunday. So if we were caught doing those types of things, we got looked at. My mother's knowing, penetrating eyes would then virtually send us to an embarrassing hole that we couldn't get out of until she finally looked away. None of us wanted to get that look because we knew the look was our fair warning, and that after the look would come her retribution. We were generally well-behaved children, if that's possible. If she were driving the car loaded with us kids, there weren't many wild and disruptive fights in the back seat or noise so loud that it would interrupt my mother's driving. And if there was, after several warnings, she would say, "I'm going to give you a backhand lick." And that ended any further untenable behavior. Over the years, we learned to listen for the tone of her admonition. I've heard that in the African and Asian languages, one word has many, many different meanings. And only by listening to the rising and falling of the syllables can the listener grasp the word's proper meaning. In this way, the listener has to have a good ear. Such was our case. Because my mother was generally a patient woman, she often gave us many chances to change our bad behavior before she chastised us. For example, we received the look when we sat in church and misbehaved. Most other mothers came down from the choir stand or wherever they sat monitoring their child's behavior while still trying to enjoy the church service, then grabbed up their disruptive child and led him or her outside to get a spanking. One look from my mother was the first warning, and if she found it necessary to give us 2 or 3 looks during the church service, we knew that even God himself could not swing down from heaven and save us from punishment when we got home. There are many things that we were never permitted to do, such as talk back to her, which my mother deemed the highest level of disrespect. Once, after we moved to our second house and had planted sugarcane for that year, my brother David, who was 14 or 15 at the time, had gotten into a fight with our brother Lionel. Because Lionel had won the altercation, David, the most hot-headed among us, stormed into the house to get my father's rifle, all the while threatening to kill Lionel. My mother, sitting quietly on the sofa, said to David, "No, you won't. You'd better get back outside with that mess." And David, in his unfortunate rage, on his way to my mother and father's room, which is where the rifle was kept, yelled to my mother, "You don't tell me what to do." And we all stopped what we were doing and waited for my mother to come off that sofa, raging herself because even though he was a growing boy and stood as tall as she, we had never heard any child speak to my mother in that way. When my brother came out from my mother and father's room with my father's gun in his hand, cocking the rifle as he walked, my mother, and this all seemed to happen in one swift moment, reached for a stalk of some of the fattest, juiciest sugar cane we had ever grown, which stood leaning against the wall, swooped down on my brother like she was a mammoth hammer with legs, and whacked him so hard over the head that he was immediately rendered unconscious, and his body went crumbling down to the floor. Then my mother went down with my brother on the floor and began to comfort him. We all stood around looking at them there on the linoleum floor. Yes, there were certain things you didn't do, no matter what time of day it was. There was a time in our young family's life when we seemed superior. In our first house, we ate our meals at a small dining room table just off the back door. There were 4 large steps that led out the door to the smooth, well-worn ground beneath. Usually my mother would pour the table scraps out the back door, and the dogs, cats, and chickens would converge as though none of them had eaten for days. I often tell people that my mother was a great cook, but they can't truly fathom how immense those words were. When she cooked lavishly and with style. Yet all the meals were practical. When we lived at our first house, I remember the huckleberry pies and the stewed potatoes and the roasted meats. And I remember coffee. My mother would serve my father coffee, but we as children couldn't have any. Coffee makes you black, my father explained to us. And although we feared getting this awful color of black that my father talked about, we all wanted to take a sip of his coffee. Usually he passed one of us his last sip, and the rest of us would suffer in silence. We'd all saved a piece of biscuit just for the possibility. The biscuit was then dropped into the cup until it soaked up all the coffee before we ate the delectable brown mush with a spoon. There came a time when the Morans moved next door to us. We could look out our bathroom window and see their house through the persimmon and pine trees across the small field that dipped like a hollow. This is the same house that the Tabor woman, my father's mistress, lived in before the Morans came. We knew the Morans had moved in when, one day at dinner, we looked out the back door, which usually stood open and against the refrigerator, and saw 3 little kids standing on and around the steps, all with snotty noses and dirt mixed in, with 1 or 2 fingers in their mouths, looking up at us there at the dinner table, gorging on the beautiful meal my mother had prepared. We were shocked almost into putting our forks back on our plates. On that day, my mother invited them in and fed them, and we watched them practically suck big chunks of food into their little mouths like we'd seen vacuum cleaners do on television. They didn't speak much. I remember elbows on the table, which made me think of the song I'd learned in first grade. Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. It was like their whole bodies were thrown into eating that food. We eventually fell in love with the Morans. I even fancied one, Danny, my little boyfriend. Soon after, things changed for us, at least for me and for the Morans. One day they came and stood around our back doorsteps, probably drawn by the smell of my mother's cooking, and waited to be invited in, but my father said no. His anger jumped out at them as though he had shot them with a weapon. I remember sitting there, looking into my Danny's young eyes and watching him twiddle his finger inside his mouth like he would eventually find food there. And we, my mother included, implored my father to change his mind, but he did not relent. There was no explaining his meanness on that day. None of us thought then that he might have sought some form of retribution against the Morans for moving into the house where his mistress had been forced to move away from. I could not think of an explanation for my father's treatment of our young neighbors, but he held on to that anger. They can eat when we're done, he said. And those words cut me, even as a child, to my core. I didn't eat anymore, thinking I would save my food for Danny, but my father ordered me to eat everything. That same scene was repeated the next day and the next. The Morans didn't seem to care that they were eating our table scraps. I guess they were so hungry that they were happy to be eating anything. But I wondered how they could return every day and take the abuse. Much later, I learned that my mother had started saving some of her best food, putting it aside and then dishing it out to them after we had left the table. On the days when I wasn't allowed to get onto the work truck with my older siblings. I helped my mother cook and take care of my two younger brothers. And in the early afternoons, I often went with my father to the dairy barn. Sometimes my father and I would take the tractor to the backfield and collect manure by throwing it into a metal fertilizer that was connected to the back of the tractor. Sometimes we would ride along the property's fence searching for holes where cows might escape to some other land. My father placed me behind the steering wheel on those occasions so that he could walk alongside the tractor, picking up piles of manure and throwing them into the fertilizer. I could barely touch the gas or brake, so I stood with my feet at the edges of the pedals, my back leaning against the tractor seat, and my arms wrapped around a steering wheel that was rounder than me. Somehow, it worked. I drove the tractor at a slow pace, waiting for my father's instructions to turn right or turn left, to stop or go, or to slow down or speed up. Years later, when I became a professional truck driver and driver trainer, I would tell my students that I could drive so well because I had started driving when I couldn't even reach the gas and brake pedals. None of them believed me. Then I tell them about my mother's driving, and they truly wouldn't believe me. I come from a long line of great drivers, I'd say. My mother, who had learned to drive when she was still quite young, drove fast yet steadily and safely. Most days she'd drive while singing one of her favorite church songs, which in turn made her want to clap her hands. So there we'd sit watching her driving, clapping, singing along. You gotta be at ease with it, she'd say. Don't be afraid of nothing. Once, we went to work for a strange white farmer. Strange at first because we were the only people he picked up that day. We had gone out into this farmer's peanut field and dug those white pubescent nuts from the ground, sometimes with our hands peeling away the soft dirt. When we finished working for the morning, the strange white man who had hired us to work for him told us to come on in the house and eat lunch with his family. I'm sure my sister Willie, in whose care we had been entrusted, thought quickly that this might be a ploy to get us inside and then rape and murder us or some other such sinister plot. So she said to the man, "Thank you, sir, but we already got lunch." In those days, we either brought a sandwich from home or bought potted meat, sardines and crackers, bologna, bread, and drinks to go around when the work truck stopped at Sunny Hill grocery store. The man was persistent in his offering to us. No, come on in, he said. My wife's already prepared the food for y'all. Come on in now. And Willie eventually capitulated, and we went marching into the strange man's house. Strange then because none of the white farmers had ever invited us in to eat with them. There were no steps, but one small one. For the back of the house sat low to the ground and held a screen porch that led to the kitchen. The man's wife, who was chubby, just like our mother, and wore an apron dirtied by use, just like our mother, came to the door of the kitchen and opened it for us. "Come on in," she said. "I figured y'all was getting hungry by now." And we went on in, slowly. Our eyes traveled around the room a couple of times before she told us to sit our tired bodies down at the table. I remember a picture of Jesus on the wall by the table, but not much else. I probably remember that picture because photographs of Jesus, his long dark hair, that sincere and loving look on his smooth white face always fascinated me as a child. But mostly, I just got carried along with the moment. My brother Lionel didn't seem to care that we were eating lunch with white folks, strange white folks at that, and he sat down and grabbed at his plate, his hand sort of guarding the plate as though he thought someone would take it. Vanessa sat down next, and then Willie and I followed. I don't remember any children, just the man and his wife. They sat down, and after he said a long and inspiring grace, she started passing the food around. And although they must have talked to us, I don't remember hearing a word. I sat there half eating, half looking out the door, and half knowing what it felt like to be one of the Morans. My mother always said, "People will lie on you when you're living, and lie for you when you're dead. My mother was an amiable woman. She had many friends over her life's journey. There's a portrait of her taken when she was in her early 20s. It always hung in my mother and father's bedroom, just above their bed. At the time of the photograph was taken, she had birthed several children already. She looked airbrushed. All the colors faded into some ambiguous representation of what they had been. And yet the portrait is still tantalizing in its aesthetic, pleasing way. Her hair is pushed back in waves of shininess. Her smile is wider and fuller than I remember her in those young days of our family's history. The purely pink lipstick is almost dark against a mouthful of glowing teeth. Her eyes are as open and as happy as ever, a slight powdery glaze covering them. And a pair of red, green, yellow colored earbobs hangs from her long lobes, almost as though they will fall at any moment. Time did not change the youthful beauty of that picture. My mother remained bright and caring and honestly different. And that's the truth. Okay. So now I'm going to read this little short one, The Woodpecker. This is the closing essay. So note how the memoir starts and how it now ends. The Woodpecker. My father's eyes are always open, or they blink to his rhythm in nature. In a gown he has worn home from the hospital, he sits at the edge of the bed, soaked to his bottom, unable to go to the bathroom properly on his own. His diaper needs to be changed. My daddy is wet, he says, unashamed and with a smile. He has not lost his cool, irreverent sense of humor. He has boy's eyes, eyes that wish to see where he will be going. He is holding on, I know, with all his strength. He wants to reach 90, just half a year away. Oh, the party my girls will give me, he says, and it is as clear as anything to be imagined. He will make it. Screw those doctors. What do they know? He waits for me to come to him, to cross the small room of the Katrina trailer. I have been sitting at the table, still eating my breakfast. I cannot help but see him as he is. Aren't those his toes beginning to curl, signaling the end of his long and passionate life? But optimism flitters all around him, pecking at his heart. Ah, the sound of it. He listens. Tap, 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 tap. The woodpecker is no more than 30 feet outside the window. It hangs by its claws from a broken hickory tree that has its top missing. I am sure the tree was healthy in its youth and grew even stronger against the uncooperativeness of time. But then it grew old. It wasn't properly nourished, which left it vulnerable to a most obtrusive wind. The bird's color is there, a full red slice down its small crown, which makes it a male. The wings are black and white ridges with a splash of red barely visible on the bird's tummy. My father and I have spent many moments aching over the bird's red-bellied beauty. Remember the one we used to have in the yard, I asked him. That was at our first house all those years ago. As a young girl, I would sit in the grass and wait for the giant woodpecker, full red head and impressive black wings. After we've listened for a long while, my father says, yeah, but this one's better. The bird, it moves in circles around the old tree, tap, 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 tap. I imagine the sound reminds my father of the weapons he used in war, or the sound of gunfire from a distance, tap, 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 tap. My father and I have history. We are both people of nature. We tried to save an ailing chicken hawk one summer. The bird in its final hours searched my father and me out as we cleared away weeds from beneath fine oak trees, which simply wanted to grow freely and give off an air of greatness and indignation. We found the bird waiting near our truck and later took it to the nearest vet clinic, but we were too late. We used to ride in my sports car with the windows down as we crossed the causeway from the country to New Orleans or to Jackson and back, rushing to his doctor's visits. We were both troubled by the VA. He, the real soldier, having fought for his country in World War II, and me, who served the Navy well as a yeoman, but never pointed a rifle at another soul. On the car rides home, we'd complain about the state of the VA hospitals and how carelessly they sometimes treated the vets. Often we stop at diners, and he'd tell me his life stories once again, sure that one day I would write them down. The stories never changed, but remained planted like small trees, growing in my memory. How he got shot in the legs in the Aleutians, how he came home from the military and found his first wife shacked up with another man, how he married my mother on Valentine's Day, how sorry he was to have mistreated her over the years of their marriage. We'd sit in the old booths and eat omelets, and he'd smile, and so he were lighter, having spoken his truth once more, neither of us aware of how quickly those moments were passing. When I go to him and help him up from the bed, I feel guilty, mostly for blaming him for so long. Perhaps the blame shifted to guilt. It could be why I am here now, doing all the dirty work. Slowly, he leans his bent, frail body into mine. He has the walk of a baby bird, his feet a slight rhythm, a sure tap here and then there, not steady like music or the tick of a clock, but it's his rhythm. We near the bathroom, and he slows even more. We both hear the tap, 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 so close beyond the window. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Juyanne. That was wonderful. We have time for questions. If you are on Zoom, you can just speak out. If you're on Facebook, if you will type your questions in the comments, that would be helpful.
Hi, Juyanne. I love your collection, especially the essays that you just read. And I love how each of them stands alone, but read as a whole, they add so much to each other. And I'm just really intrigued about the order in which you wrote the essays, because I think in the preface you write that Table Scraps was one of the last essays you wrote, but it's the first in the collection. And so I wondered if, they came to you mostly chronologically, or if you had to reorder them later when you were compiling them into a collection.
Good question. Thank you. I wrote these essays over the course of, almost 20 years. I was getting this is really the work of my thesis at the University of New Orleans. I was getting my master's, and I lost my mother, and it was the most traumatic thing that could have happened to me. And I thought I would die, literally. And, I fully expected that I would just pass away and that would be the end of me. But at the same time, I happened to be in a creative writing class and nonfiction. And suddenly I had this ability to write about it and to get a lot of that off my mind, as it were. And so at the same time I was writing about my mother's loss, I was finding my voice as a writer. And my mentor, Randy Bates, a wonderful teacher at University of New Orleans, it was really helpful and slowly working with me on, and encouraging me to write all of these things. So a lot of the essays come from that period of loss, of grief. And I remember at some point someone said, yeah, it might be easy to write from pain, to write from grief. But how do you just write otherwise? And my only answer is, I don't know, because I've been grieving. It's kind of like Natasha said, I've been grieving forever. I don't think you ever get over losing the most important person in your life. It just doesn't happen. That grief is always there. So I think in a way, I always write from that perspective of pain. So I don't know what it would be like to write otherwise. So a lot of these essays came from that experience. I continued to write when I got my MFA at Spalding University in Louisville. And a lot of those essays, you know, had a little bit of distance from the grief. And so I ventured out and I started to write more about my father, because the wonderful thing that happened after my mom died is that I found my father, and he and I started to work together on a project one summer, clearing, you know, beautiful oak trees. I don't know if you've ever seen them, when like brush and things get underneath the tree and it just clogs it up, and they just look like they're ailing. The trees look like they're ailing. So we were hired to clear these trees and bring those trees back to their beautiful essence. And doing that work alongside him that summer, we sort of got to know each other again. We both talked about the grief that we were feeling about my mother, and we just sort of connected and started to bond. And at the same time, you know, he had prostate cancer. And if you're going to get cancer, you know, prostate sort of is the one to get as a guy, because, you know, he lasted for almost 20 years after his diagnosis. And so during that time, he and I were able to bond. I was able to forgive him for a lot of the stuff that he had done in my youth, because truly, you know, it's a redemptive story, I always say, because he changed. He became a greater man, a wonderful person. And it just, you know, he taught me that, you know, whoever you were is not always who you have to be. You can always change and become greater. So by the time he died, one of the reasons why I love that final essay is because he and I had become so close at that point, which was really a great distance to have, you know, figured out, basically. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. We have what could be a good follow-up question from Facebook from Albert Leftwich. He was asking whether your memoir essays emerge from a memory, an image, a sound, or something like that. How do they come to you?
Oh, that's interesting. That's a good question. They come from just everything. Typically, my fiction, I consider myself a fiction writer. The creative nonfiction is just something that's in essence me, and it's just who I am. But when I write my most creatively, I'm writing fiction. And so the fiction typically comes from, maybe I see someone walking down the street and I think, what, you know, who's that person and what happens to them? So it might be just me imagining things. But for my essays, it just typically comes from memories. And for people who write memoir, they probably might say the same thing. You sort of go back into your past, and I think Rilke said this, the poet, great poet, said, you know, after you ask yourself whether you must write, then what are you going to write about? So one of the best things you can do is go back into your youth and write all those things that are just in your memory. And if they're in your memory, there's a reason why they're there. So typically that's what I do. I go back and write those memories that are just, you know, blaring at me, please let me out, kind of thing. So a lot of my essays come from the memories of my childhood. The older I get, I find that I'm writing more about the way I understand life, how you know, I've gotten older now and I want to leave something behind. So those essays now come from, I don't know, just life. What am I leaving behind, I would say, yeah. But mostly my youth, yeah. Hope that answers that.
I have a little bit of a question about writing about grief, because I am one of the MFA students at MEW, and I'm just starting to dive into this. I lost my mother over 20 years ago, and I lost my brother this year. And I find it quite excruciating to write about. And even though I'm doing it, man, I fight the urge to dumb it down and pull it back and not let loose of it, because if I let loose of it, it's terrifying. So I just wonder if you could sort of speak to how you work through that kind of thing.
You mean how do you just get beyond the grief and just keep writing?
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing you do is because creative nonfiction demands that you are your complete honest self. There is no way you can just write something and try to put forth small bits of it. Well, I'll just tell this part and I'll hold this part back. It doesn't work like that. And that's really scary when you're writing about grief, because a lot of times it's just so painful, and writing about it. I've heard other writers even today talk about, oh, how painful, how emotional you get in writing, endings and things. There's in my memoir, there's a poem I wrote. I was telling my students this the other night. We were talking about the memoir, and I wanted to discuss one of the stories, and I really wanted to talk about that poem. But every time I read that poem, it's like, going back to the day my mother died. And nobody wants to go back to that moment of grief. You just don't want to go there. So I told them I really wanted to read it, but I can't do it. I mean, I just can't read it because it just takes me back to that moment. And it's painful. And yet, I can remember writing that poem and feeling so much better at having gotten it out, putting it on the paper, and seeing it, and now having something I could go back to sometimes and read it and feel like I'm really that much closer to my mother, because that poem, Mama, it really just in essence says everything about her, what she meant to me. So maybe it's just being a little bit courageous. And sometimes just not feeling bad yourself at not being able to write it. Sometimes things aren't ready to be written. A lot of the things I wrote about in this memoir, there's still tons of things that I need to say, but I wasn't ready to say it at that moment. So don't feel bad yourself if you're not ready at that moment. I think creative nonfiction demands that you be ready to say whatever it is you're going to say. And if you're not ready, then wait until you are. That's just all there is to it. You can't half do it. You can't, let me say a little bit, leave back, because what happens is your reader will be able to see that and understand that you left something back. So I encourage you to just let it have its time, and when it's ready to come, I think it'll come.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also in the MFA program. I loved your essays, and it seemed like so many of them had a strong theme of patience and tolerance and forgiveness. It seemed to run through almost all of them. And I guess what I'm wondering is, given that, would you like to see your book used in the public school system to, given the current climate, do you think it would be useful to help reduce some of the divisiveness that exists?
Wow, that's a powerful question. Thank you. I would love it if it would do any good. One of the reasons why I put questions at the end of the book is that I wanted to, maybe perhaps if it found its way into that arena or those arenas, that students or whomever was reading it might have something to question and study, as it were. Because I think there are a lot of important themes there about, as you say, love and forgiveness. I was telling my students the other day, I mean, there isn't anything more important than figuring out that you have to forgive people. And that's hard for us. And we're, no, I don't have to forgive them. I could just forget about them. I don't have to see my parents. I don't have to see my sibling. Just forget it. I don't like them. They did this to me, and let me just move on. Why? They're your family. People make mistakes. One of the best things my mom taught me was that you got to forgive and you got to move on. You can't just throw people away because they upset you or they did something to you. Figure out a way to forgive them and move on. They're your family. That's all there is to it. And I think as a wider audience, the world itself, that's a message I wish the world really would. I mean, come on, we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. Let's all just try to get along. Whoever said that. But it's totally true. Hatred is completely a waste of time. It's not going to get you anywhere. You're not going to be productive in your life. It's going to take up your life. And sooner or later, you're going to wake up one day and say, where did my life go? You will not have fulfilled anything. So yeah, I think it'd be wonderful for people to read that and say, wow, here's a young family that had a father that was behaving in outrageous ways, right? I mean, some of the things he was doing, I say, we were talking about the other night, Chain of Fools, some of the things he was doing should have torn our family completely apart. But you have that glue who was our mother, who believed in the apparent goodness in every human being, who believed that her children should not be raised without a father, who believed that, you know, we got to forgive this guy. We got to teach him how to behave in a better way, live in a better way. And until people start taking responsibility and saying, well, no, we're not just going to let you, you know, treat other people like this. We all need to come together and treat each other with love and respect and forget about what may have happened. Let's just move on. Let's forgive. Let's forget. There is redemption in everything. And at some point, as my mother used to say, everybody's going to need redemption. You're all going to need forgiveness for something. So don't think you're going to, you know, get through this life and not have to ask someone for forgiveness. So, yeah, just think about what's important in life, I would say. Something I learned from my mom. So yeah, she taught us a lot of great stuff, but the main thing was just to try to enjoy your life and move on, and let's not spend our time just hating and other people. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
As you stated, love and forgiveness and redemption were themes throughout this, and I really loved the work. Thank you so much. Was there anything in there that you had to write through your own forgiveness, your own kind of redemption? I know you talked about Willie Byrne, where you felt like you didn't spend enough time there, but was there anything else that you felt you were writing your own redemption throughout the piece?
Well, that's a good question. The things that I write more now, I find that it's more me trying to go back and say, well, where could I have been better? That memoir, I think, was more about my mom and dad's relationship, and I sort of fit in there somewhere. But yeah, that essay about Willie Byrne, I wanted to read that today, but it makes me sad, and I couldn't read it. But yeah, at the end, I talk about, you know, and I think that's true about, and I don't want to say young people, you know, label you guys young, you're young and you don't know how to, you know, look at people and care about people. That's not true. But when I was young, I was just too carefree. I was out there living life in a crazy way. And yeah, I could have been more present in my sister's life. I could have done a lot more to help my parents, my mother in particular. And what that taught me, and one of the reasons why I ended that essay that way, is that we don't want to have regrets. And if you don't want to have regrets, then sort of every day, look at the people in your life that you love and just appreciate them a little bit. Even if you're just saying, you know, hey, I love you, or, you know, go up to them, give them a hug or something. Look at other people, be aware of other people, especially the ones in your lives and what they mean to you. So I thought that I did that with my mother, I think, because she lived a little bit longer than my sister. And what that taught me, my sister's death, was that, you know, be a little bit more aware. And so that the remaining time that I had with my mother, I think I did that. I started to, you know, make her aware of just how much I cared for her and appreciated her. So, yeah. Yeah, but more now, I think I'm starting to get into my next memoir, whatever it is, will, yeah, be a lot of me and what I should have done.
Thank you, Juyanne. we're going to go ahead and now talk with and listen to Sandra Meeks. She received her BA in, making sure I was on, she received her BA in English and MFA in creative writing from Colorado State University and a PhD in English creative writing from the University of Denver. She spent several years volunteering as an English teacher in the Peace Corps in Botswana. She is the Dana Professor of English Rhetoric and Writing at Berry College in Mount Berry. She is also poetry editor of Phi Kappa Phi Forum, director of the Georgia Poetry Circuit, and co-founding editor of Nine Bark Press. She is also the editor of Deep Travel, Contemporary American Poets Abroad, which won a 2008 Independent Publisher Book Award, a recipient of a 2011 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Poetry, and winner of the 2015 Lucille Medwick Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. She has been named Georgia Author of the Year in Poetry 3 times, and she has twice been awarded the Peace Corps Writers Award. Her poems have appeared in the American Poetry Review, Agni, Terrain.org, Ecotone, the Kenyon Review, Prairie Schooner, Poetry, Conjunctions, and the Iowa Review, among many others. Still is her 6th book of poetry, and it was named a top spring poetry title by Library Journal. A review in the New York Times Book Review states that Meek's prescient poetry has long dwelled darkly on humanity's environmental impact. In this book, her 6th, the tone was grown urgent, even apocalyptic. A review in the Library Journal states that Sandra Meek treats her elegantly crafted poems as still lifes, displaying the catastrophes of history. So we're looking forward to hearing those. Sandra?
Thank you so much for that. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all and to get to read with Juyanne. And it was a real honor to get to read all of the entries for the high school competition. We weren't just kidding when we said we had a really hard time. That was real, because there was so much good writing. And it was wonderful to get to hear some of you all read today as well. So keep writing. You're doing some fabulous stuff, all of you. I'll say just a couple words about the book before I get started. So the book is kind of in conversation, not just with still life painting, but also with Renaissance cabinets of wonder. So the Renaissance cabinet of wonder, if you're not familiar with that, was this juxtaposition of these different things. So it would bring together small human-made objects like miniature paintings with natural objects, often taken from places that the Europeans in the Renaissance were claiming as discoveries, right? And so these objects, things like feathers or shells or skulls of little animals, were often from species that they didn't have a name for. They were these fascinating sort of unknown objects, and they'd be all juxtaposed here. So one thing that the structure of the book does is it kind of reimagines the idea of a studiolo, which was a room in the Renaissance that contained multiple cabinets of wonder. So the book is divided into sections that are called cabinets. And so there's all this juxtaposition going on there. So I got really fascinated with these cabinets of wonder. And, so at the time, obviously with the name, these objects really resonated for their viewers with amazement, with wonder. But from our present time, it's hard not to look at those and think about the full catastrophe of Western imperialism and the destruction of cultures, the violence that happened on peoples, on civilizations, on women, on the environment as a result of that. So there is a lot of environmental material in the book, a lot of thinking about violence. But also, and this goes to the title of the book itself, still, the book plays with the multiple meanings of the word still too. So still on one hand is, of course, no motion, like in lifeless, but still also means something that remains, something that survives. So the book is also about what survives as well as what has not. So I'm going to read you a few poems from the book. This first one is about a coral reef creature. It's entitled Still Life with Caribbean Reef Squid, Sepia toothes sepioidea. And I'll tell you just a couple of fun facts about the squid, if you're not super familiar with squids. They have the largest eye to body ratio in the animal kingdom. They have these huge eyes. And when you're in the water and you're swimming with them, you see they swim in these small groups. And what's super cool about them is they communicate through changing colors, and they can do it in just elaborate and very nuanced ways. And so they'll sort of swim in a group, kind of stacked this way. And their communication is so complex that they're able to turn like one color pattern on this side to communicate with the guy over here, and a different pattern on the other side to say something different to the squid over there. And of course, you probably know that when they're frightened, they can also squirt an ink kind of substance. So let's see, just a couple other little tiny things for the poem. A goby is a tiny fish that you might see poking its head out from a brain coral. Sperm whale oil was used in oil lamps until the late 19th century. So still life with Caribbean reef squid. What swam back from the dough damp eye, your own goggled face, unfinished as the gobies you treaded sea against the surf surging, to witness emerge from its brain coral cave, that fogged head-on perspective, rendering it simple beyond its being. A gas-masked gesture drawing, crosshatched to shadows. As against high cotton brag paper, stroke by stroke you remember a man who sketched you as you slept, packing on charcoal until it approximated the darkness the face meant to rise against. You saw it before you knew its name, knowing only the creature had seen you, knowing this only by its quick disappearance. But the squid do not startle. Fins rippling, sleek bodies gleaming liquid as wax, sprung from the head cavity of a sperm whale, sparked to specter the flame it would wick to only when the knives were docked. Their arms extend, mimicking sargassum weed. Hovering, though you know what's coming, still it surprises how sudden the unfurling, the arms flash flowering to star anemone, how fierce they're drilling the dark pockets for what harbored in the hope refuge might lie in a bed of hard corals. How you trailed this ravenous unfolding, shadowing their trolling, the fringe reef, iridescent, crushed pearl mounds, studded with fan corals, lavender and lime, royal purple, waved from stiff wrists of holdfasts by leeward's muted, moon-driven surf. Dusky anchovy, hardhead silver sides, shrimp, dwarf herring, all things soft devoured, all things armored, discarded, head, ribs, vertebral column, a single unsheathing. To walk on water is to miss this world by half. This immersion taught you. No alarms, gold brightening, no brick red of retreat, no diversion of ink clouding their swerve into distance. Like sequins cast in organza veils, a spray of sinkers woven to fishing nets translucence. They signed each to each in shimmering chromatics you could read only as radiance, diminishment propelling you on. Whether hours or minutes, you could not say. You followed, then led to the coral's fossil-strewn shore. The shell of you returned. The second poem I'm going to read is also about a sea creature, but this one's a little bit different. The title of the poem is Still with Severed Tongue, Symathoa exigua, tongue-eating isopod, and Lujanus guttatus, spotted rose snapper. So if you're not familiar with this creature, the Symathoa isopods are the only known parasite which both consumes and replaces the organ of its host animal. So let me just share this picture of, let me see if this works. You see the tongue there? That's the isopod. Or another angle. Not to give you nightmares or anything, but so that's the creature that this poem is about. And so this is a persona poem. And in this, the tongue-eating isopod is addressing the fish that's serving as its host victim. Let's see, just a couple other little things. So a pill bug that's mentioned in the poem, that's a roly-poly bug, which is a relative of this isopod. And the tongue-eating isopod has 5 sets of jaws, just for another nice little image. Warm, fuzzy creature. Still with severed tongue. Symathoa exigua, tongue-eating isopod, and Lujanus guttatus, spotted rose snapper. Did you feel it, that first prick at your throat, at my arrival's muscled root, finale to parting your gills frilled arc as smoothly as a hand slips into the silk slit of a girl's sleeve? How I hummed your heart's double-chambered thrum, all my jaws aching me on. Vessel by vessel, I sawed with a grace surgical and determined. Bathed anew, each gasp, wasn't I wrapped in the blood of abandon, a sustenance never meant to sustain? Thus I was eager for atrophy, the late stage withering, your unstrung tongue drifting down to the fire coral, blades burnt gold and white-tipped as ash or the needle eye of flame. There, it was set upon by others, no longer my concern. Their dawn rose blush, gold ellipses stippling the silvered scallops of their scales. I, wanting nothing but to ride your liquid pitch as you troll the mounded, opalescent ledge for what darts from its kinks and dark crevices. When I latched your sweet stub for good, why, at that dearest jointing, did you owe your mouth, though nothing swam near to feed us? Only that slow undulation, twisting above coral, all mouth and anus and sting, extended tentacles fine as a boy's faintest chin hairs. If you are host, am not I the master mistress of ceremonies, oracle to your priest? Am not I poles for my brethren who write out their lives on the surface of a face, never getting beneath the skin, the scales? Benign, symbiotic, meaning too timid to cut in. Poles for my land-stranded cousin, pillbug that fear helmets to a ball small as the eraser of the pencil any grubby child might poke it with. Hyphen and hinge to your hunger satisfied. Didn't I heal the wound I cleaved you to? Still, you would dream it, blooded and pulsing, eel sleek, branched high in the staghorn, ululating the duration. But isn't dullness a kind of relief, living as the flip side of serration? And don't I have dominion over the fish of the sea, banishing even your burgeoning phantom limb from this vaulted chapel I lie in? Because you did not take the bait descending from sky hung on a wire dyed the exact cerulean of the shallows that held you through aftermath. What came from sea itself, from the very waters that rocked you, from which you could not at once have sealed yourself safe and breathed. All your life now, I will be the live thing ghosting you from inside, the slick of my eyes, last vision for prey or for kind, whomever you open your mouth to, as if you might speak. This next one's a very short poem. The title, Still Life with Zodiac Boat and Glacier Lagoon. And so this is set in Iceland's Jökulsárlón Glacier Lagoon. And now it covers like 18 square kilometers and it's almost 250 meters deep in some places. 70 to 80 years ago, there was no lagoon at all. Then Europe's largest glacier there began melting. Now the lagoon is 4 times the size that it was in the 1970s. Still life with Zodiac Boat and Glacier Lagoon. A bowl of white light, spiked moraine peaks, debris veined, black ash and gravel till, blue milk fins calving into melt. Too much to stay against, one's own weight borne by speed, by wind, not weather, but the fast forward of a century on fire, bulled forth by my own eyes burning toward sheared sapphire, by the pull cord's raveling wick with which I lit this engine, this small blind body of need. All right, so I'll read 2 more poems. This next one is another persona poem, still with Judas goats. So this poem is set in the Galapagos Islands where I traveled a few years ago. And so at Isabella, this island, feral goats had nearly destroyed the ecosystem. And so the survival of the island's giant tortoises was very much in question. So 2004 to 2006, a group of environmentalists got together to save the tortoise. And so the way that they decided they needed to do it was to kill all of the island's feral goats, which were 100,000 goats. So what they did was they shot the goats from helicopters, right? So they would just fly over and shoot them down. But then the problem was, so that got rid of a lot of them. The problem was the goats learned to avoid the helicopters, and there were some places that they could hide. And so some of the goats hid under rocks, and so they couldn't get them from the helicopters. And for the project to work, they had to get rid of all of the goats. So they created Judas goats. So to do that, they would get female goat, and they would sterilize her. And if she was already pregnant, then they would terminate the pregnancy. They would sterilize her, and then they would give her massive hormones that would make her super attractive to male goats. Then they put a radio collar on the goat, and then they would put her in the helicopter, they would fly her out somewhere, and they would drop her on the island. And so goats are super gregarious creatures. And so not only would the male goats come out because they were attracted to the hormones, but then all the other goats would follow the male goats out. And so they would build again this collection of goats. Then the guys in the helicopters came, shot them all, except for the Judas goats, which they could recognize because of her collar. So then they would pick up the Judas goat, take her to another place, and do it all over again. And by doing this, they did indeed save the tortoises of Isabella. Not sure how we should feel exactly about all of that, but that's the backstory. All right, so this is another persona poem. Still with Judas goats. Project Isabella, Galapagos. Selection began the terror. How I loved my new necklace, his glittering noosed ear always upon me. When he came first from the sky, when he slipped the hood over my horns, stood me onto my shoulders, I felt a sting, a clip, a brightness distancing my body. As what had quickened in me, stilled in his hands, I knew he couldn't bear to share me. Shot with the needle, dripping unending desire of others for me, didn't I dutifully draw my kind from their caves, making again our little society? Forgive me. Those days I almost forgot him. When the five-bladed sky powered its seraphim shadow upon us, how we ran, I with them, the ones who'd mounted me, the little ones racing still for their mother's teats, how they dropped to their knees, their legs snapped broomsticks, leaves still spun from the glossy corners of their mouths, their fur glistening with rain-sleek roses, lipsticked kisses blown from their bodies. But wasn't I the beloved, the one left, taken again under his wing until it all again began? How many times this occurred is beyond my measure. Finally, I could gather only those like me, the startled girls, each of us taken in to believe we were the one. We knew each other by our war-slicked eyes, the echo of our sutured, future-emptied bodies, how we each wore the charm of his listening around our neck. And no more did the sky empty upon us, no more did he come for us. The grass grew lush under our few hooves, for we did not increase. And the great ones, who had long withered inside their domed shells, began again to move among us. The ones we now knew all had been done for, though we were left freely to eat what we would, what would have fed so many lost we'd led. Oh God, in the whirling machine, didn't we well bring your weather down? Now we bow our heads only to the recovering green. All right, so for this final poem, I'm going to come a little bit closer to home here, to Southern Appalachia. So this poem was written for a literary field guide to Southern Appalachia about the bloodroot. And I want to just read a little description from that book about the bloodroot. So they write, to walk Southern Appalachian woods in early March and find the first bloodroot flower, broad, pristine white petals arrayed around yellow yolk stamens, is to know spring has begun. These ephemeral flowers disappear within days, however, and seed pods form, long capsules with pursed tips where seeds ripen. The seeds have large elaiosomes or oil bodies that provide food for ants, which in turn disperse the seeds of the plant. So to that, I'll just add that, well, native ants play an important role in the bloodroot's survival and the seed dispersal. The invasive fire ant, which is rapidly spreading through the region, typically destroys the seed as it feeds. Also, the bloodroot is rarely found in disturbed landscapes. Still life with bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. Brain veined, cabbaged around a single bud, embarrassed canopy, your one winged leaf unfurls to a lemon crown of anthers, to ghost white petals quick thinning to translucence, to capsule unzipping its pod of pursed seeds, nut brown, glossy as tiger eye, elaiosomes umbilical froth, coiling each globed bead. The dormant future figured as apple and worm, though your whole is generative. Even these filmy members, winnow ants, copper baubles spider wired to filigree, feed their young, leaving the seed to sprout from nest debris. There are those who thrive in margins, who survive the wild shrinking, coyote, raccoon, dandelion, fire ants overrunning forest and field, who take the bait but destroy the seed. Outsiders, how can we help but hunger? Bloodroot, you unscroll to the staggered world of fence posts, no new flowers. Your given name a study in slicing a clotted root to bleed. This world so beautiful, we could eat you whole. Bloodroot, redroot, tedderwort, sweet slumber. Nest, I call you by, scouting your woods. Whether as winnow or fire, I come to you. What begins each spring, one more vanishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. We have time for a few questions. Again, if you're on Facebook, if you'll type them into the comments, and if you're here live, feel free.
I'll ask Cindy, do you think of your work as really being political. I mean, I love your message in your poetry. It's beautiful. I mean, love your work, but do you write in that vein? I'll ask.
Um, I would say yes, but sort of a qualified yes. So with this book particular, I do see it very much about the kind of violence that we do on the world, and so I mean that is colonial, that is cultural, racist, so many different things. This book particularly, I think, focuses on the environmental and the sexual. And I think you kind of got the suggestion of that in the persona poems. There is a weaving together of those concerns. And so actually, and I don't know if you all get this, but the AWP Chronicle, the Writer's Chronicle, that journal, in the current issue, I have a conversation with 4 other environmental women poets, Brenda Hillman, Amy Nestakumatadl, Camille Dungy, and Allison Hedgecoke. And it's about those 2 things together. And we started really thinking about that sort of in the Me Too context. You know, there's so much connection between sexual violence, misogyny, and environmental violence. And so in this book, that is very much at the foremost. I think some other work approaches the political in different ways, but I think that's really what's going on here. Thank you for that.
Sandra, I'm in the MFA program, by the way. You write with such incredible detail and such amazing visual images. Are you getting to travel to all of these places like Iceland and the Galapagos? And how cool is that?
Yeah, it's my favorite thing in the world. So this is a hard year right here. Yeah, they are from, I have written about places I haven't been to in other things, but this book is weaving together places I have traveled to. So yeah. So the first, actually, this kind of connects to Juyanne's question as well. So those couple of reef poems are from my, sorry for the pun, immersive experience in Culebra, Puerto Rico. And some of the work that is going to be in the next book about that is much more looking at the political colonial situation of Culebra. So I'll just give you like the 30-second version of this because I could talk about Culebra for hours and hours. So Culebra, 3rd smallest island of Puerto Rico, from roughly World War II to 1975, the United States entire Atlantic fleet of the US Navy trained by firing upon Culebra, an inhabited island. And so my work about that's post this book, certainly the environmental is there, but much more about the activists themselves. I have been lucky enough to form relationships with some of the activists who, amazingly, less than 1,000 people on that island. And during La Lucha, which was an activist struggle, 1970 to 1975, less than 1,000 people successfully kicked the US Navy out of Culebra. And a number of those activists are still alive and living on Culebra. And so that work has been very important to me. And of course, their environment, the environment is very political. One of the things that the Navy did to intimidate people was to detonate bombs in the coral reefs where they had their fisheries, right? So it's all very, very interconnected. But yes, so they are places that I have been to, and I feel like I have some kind of connection for, love for, respect for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. I got to visit your website when I was doing a little research on you, so I know that you're also an accomplished photographer.
Oh,
and I was wondering, does your poetry and your photography interact? Do they like in some way inspire each other or work together in some way? Or have you even considered doing something that was multimedia?
yeah, that's a great question. And I should say out there to the real photographers, I like to look at things and I like to take pictures of them when I look at them. And then I like to compose them, but I'm not anywhere a professional photographer or even a good amateur photographer. I just like to look at things and take their pictures. But I really like to look at things and take their pictures. How they interact, I think in several ways. I think it started by, I really did just enjoy looking at things in my travels, and it was a kind of memory device as well, and I still use it that way. So, but right now I'm doing some work writing about research and time that I spent in Belize with some environmental activists, and I took tons of pictures of our journeys out into the forests, etc., looking for the endangered scarlet macaw and other creatures. So I took tons of pictures, and as I'm writing, I do go back to those as I go back to interviews that I did with the environmentalists. So I feel like there's a lot of connection between photography and poetry, because it is the attention to a moment and to the concrete and to the physical. And so, yeah, I kind of resist the idea of doing like a book that brings them together, because I feel like in that way they might sort of take away from each other. I'd like for the poems to be the poems and the pictures to be the pictures. Although I have to say that with this new format of Zoom, I briefly considered, I could maybe screen share some pictures of these places. And then I thought, no, this is all going to just be my travel pictures if I do that. You want to see my slides of my summer vacation? So I successfully resisted asking about that anyway.
Well, thank you. We are just about out of time. So could we give our two speakers a final virtual round of applause? Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We hope to see you this evening at 7 p.m. and again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Have a great afternoon.